You know the name, William Shakespeare. The guy who gave us Romeo, Macbeth, Hamlet, and more existential monologues than a philosophy major on their third espresso. He's the literary goat, the playwright people quote when they want to sound deep, the man who allegedly invented hundreds of words we still use today. But here's what your English teacher probably didn't tell you. For a good chunk of his adult life, there's no actual record of what he was doing. Nothing. Not a single scrap of reliable documentation. The man just disappears. We know he was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564, baptized on April 26th to a local glovemaker and town official. We know he got married in 1582 to Anne Hathaway. No, not that one. And we know his twins were born in 1585. And then, crickets. Total blackout. No letters. No diaries. No receipts. No theater records. No gossip columns. It's as if the man who would go on to write Hamlet and King Lear stepped into a fog for 7 straight years. When he finally pops back up in 1592, it's not as some failed merchant or struggling actor. It's as a fully formed literary genius already stirring up jealousy in London's theater scene. A jealous rival, Robert Greene, famously referred to him in a scathing pamphlet as an upstart crow, mocking Shakespeare's lack of a university degree and theatrical pedigree. Translation: who does this guy think he is, crashing the elite party and writing circles around the insiders? So now the question becomes, what happened during those missing years? Where did he go? Who was he with? And how did he transform from a glovemaker's son with a pregnant wife into one of the greatest writers in history? Cue the conspiracy theories. Some believe he fled Stratford after getting caught poaching deer from a nobleman's estate. A pretty poetic origin story for someone who'd later write about exiles and outlaws. Others think he joined a traveling troupe of actors and cut his teeth in the grungy world of roadshow theater. A few theorists, because there are always a few, insist he traveled to Italy, soaking up Renaissance culture like a sponge, which, conveniently, could explain how he wrote Othello, The Merchant of Venice, and Romeo and Juliet with such continental flair. But the wildest theory? Some say he was working as a spy. Yes, really. England in the late 1500s was a pressure cooker of religious tension and political intrigue. The Queen had secret agents all over the place sniffing out Catholic sympathizers and foreign plots. Some researchers suggest Shakespeare may have been part of this shadowy network, possibly recruited by one of his well-connected Stratford neighbors. If true, it would explain why his paper trail vanishes, because spies don't leave receipts, and why he had such an intuitive grasp of power, paranoia, and betrayal in his plays. Is any of this provable? Of course not. That's the magic and the maddening mystery of Shakespeare. He left us 39 plays, 154 sonnets, and basically 0 personal details. No diary entries. No handwritten drafts. No definitive portrait. Just genius-level art and a trail of question marks. So before we lull you into a peaceful literary nap with his charming plays and Elizabethan drama, let's remember this. William Shakespeare may be the most famous writer of all time, but the man himself? Still kind of a ghost. Long before he was rubbing shoulders, metaphorically or otherwise, with monarchs and theater moguls, William Shakespeare was just a kid in a market town whose biggest claim to fame was sheep farming and leather goods. Stratford-upon-Avon, nestled in the English countryside, was no Renaissance hotspot. There were no salons, no courts, no artistic collectives. Just muddy streets, modest homes, and the dull drone of rural life. And it was here, in April of 1564, that William Shakespeare entered the world, just 3 days before the town was struck by a plague outbreak that would kill 1/10 of its population. A subtle foreshadowing, maybe, of all the death and drama he'd later write into his plays. His father, John Shakespeare, was a glovemaker, technically a widower, which meant he worked with soft white leather, and a man on the rise. John wasn't just crafting gloves, he was hustling. He bought land, sold wool illegally on the side, allegedly, and managed to climb his way up to become an alderman and eventually the town's bailiff, basically the local mayor. He was civic-minded, ambitious, and well-connected. For a while, The Shakespeares were considered one of the more respectable families in town. But that rise? It didn't last. By the time young William was in his teens, the family fortunes were unraveling fast. John started skipping council meetings, stopped showing up to church, and eventually lost his positions of authority. Debt collectors came knocking, and the Shakespeare name, which once held some weight, became a cautionary tale. One theory is that John, a known Catholic sympathizer in a very Protestant England, got caught in the political crossfire. There are records showing he refused to attend mandatory Protestant church services and may have secretly signed a Catholic spiritual testament stashed in the rafters of his house. In Shakespeare's England, that wasn't just controversial, it was borderline treasonous. So, while the future bard was learning his Latin and rhetoric at Stratford's grammar school, where he likely read Ovid, Virgil, and Seneca, his family was spiraling socially and financially. And here's the kicker. There's no official record of Shakespeare ever attending university. Unlike his fellow playwrights, Marlowe, Greene, and the rest of the so-called university wits, Shakespeare never got the Oxford or Cambridge stamp of approval. He didn't come for money. He didn't have patrons in his youth. He was a provincial boy with a decent education, a family in decline, and no clear path to literary greatness. Yet somehow, this teenager from a financially flailing household managed to absorb not only classical literature, but also the cadence of everyday life. The gossip, the rhythms of speech, the local legends, the ugly hypocrisies of small-town politics. It's all there in his work. Hidden beneath the royal courts and Roman tragedies are flashes of market-town mud and middle-class aspiration. His characters speak like real people because Shakespeare had lived with real people. And here's a detail worth lingering on. Stratford wasn't a big city, but it was a place where ideas traveled. It had roads leading to major trading hubs. Touring theater troupes occasionally passed through. And while there's no proof Shakespeare saw a play as a child, it's very likely. Imagine him standing at the edge of a crowd, watching a traveling company perform some rowdy morality play with costumes and sword fights and over-the-top villains. That kind of spectacle would have left a mark on a boy with an ear for language and a mind for drama. So while historians and skeptics love to raise eyebrows over how a country boy with no university education could write the most celebrated works in English literature, they often underestimate just how fertile the ground in Stratford may have been. The tension of a collapsing household, the whisper of forbidden religion, the thrill of visiting players, the grind of small-town status anxiety. All of it gave Shakespeare exactly what he needed: an ear, an eye, and a reason to escape. And escape he would, but not before making a detour into one of the juiciest chapters of his early life: a teenage marriage to a much older woman, a suspiciously timed pregnancy, and a wedding that came together with lightning speed. Because before William Shakespeare could become the Bard of Avon, he was a young man in a hurry. Whether by choice or circumstance, we're still not quite sure. If Shakespeare were alive today, this is the chapter that would be splashed across every gossip site, podcast, and history-themed true crime TikTok. Because in late 1582, 18-year-old William Shakespeare was suddenly, unexpectedly, and let's not sugarcoat it, urgently married to a woman named Anne Hathaway. And while the history books often treat this as a footnote, the timeline reads less like a sweet country romance and more like the Elizabethan version of a shotgun wedding. Let's lay it out. Shakespeare was 18 years old, legally a minor by the standards of the day. Anne was 26. In Elizabethan England, that age gap wasn't unheard of, but it was unconventional, especially with the woman being older. And just to turn the volume up on the drama, Anne was already 3 months pregnant when the marriage license was filed. Now, the license itself is a little sketchy. It was rushed, issued with a special waiver that allowed them to skip the usual requirement for 3 public announcements of the marriage called bans. Why the rush? Because a baby was coming and the clock was ticking. But that's not even the weirdest part. The license refers to the groom as William Shakespeare and the bride as Anne Whately of Temple Grafton. Whately? That's not a typo historians can confidently explain. Was it a clerical error? A different woman? Was Shakespeare supposed to marry someone else and swapped brides mid-process? No one knows for sure, but it's one of those tiny details that keeps conspiracy theorists up at night. A day later, a second document surfaces, a marriage bond this time, with Anne Hathaway's correct name and her pregnancy more or less confirmed by the expedited nature of the agreement. So, whatever confusion happened behind the scenes, the wedding went through. Fast, quiet, questionable. It's the kind of rush ceremony that feels less like a celebration and more like damage control. And what does Shakespeare do next? Does he settle into married life and prepare to become a family man? Not exactly. Within a few years, by the time his twins, Hamlet and Judith, are born in 1585, he effectively vanishes from Stratford's records. He doesn't buy property there. He doesn't appear to be living with Anne. There's no sign he ever held a steady job in town. For all we know, he just left. Which raises the obvious question, what was that marriage really? Some scholars argue that Shakespeare and Anne were genuinely in love, and the pregnancy was simply a case of passion moving faster than paperwork. Others see it as a forced union, one driven by parental pressure, societal shame, or both. There's even a school of thought that believes Shakespeare resented the marriage, seeing it as an obstacle to his ambitions. After all, once he hit the London stage scene, Anne Hathaway basically disappears from his narrative. She never joins him in London. She's never mentioned in his letters, not that we have many, and she's not clearly referenced in any of his plays, not lovingly anyway. And then there's the final twist. When Shakespeare died in 1616, his will left the bulk of his estate to his daughter Susanna and almost nothing to Anne. What did he leave his wife? His second-best bed. That's it. No land. No money. Just the second-best bed in the house. Now, defenders of Shakespeare's marriage argue that the second-best bed may have held sentimental value, that it was their marriage bed, while the best bed was for guests. Maybe it was a romantic gesture disguised as a snub. But let's be honest, when your will becomes a centuries-long topic of marital speculation, things were probably not exactly #couple goals. Still, Anne remained in Stratford, living in the home Shakespeare bought for her, and she outlived him by 7 years. Whether their relationship was strained, strategic, or simply private, we'll never know for sure. What we do know is that this strange, accelerated marriage was the last firm glimpse we get of Shakespeare before he vanishes from the record for nearly a decade. And when he reappears, it's not as a husband, or a father, or a provincial nobody. He resurfaces in the heart of London's cutthroat theater scene, already making waves, already drawing fire from literary elites. A transformation like that doesn't happen overnight, and it definitely doesn't happen without a story. Which brings us to the most frustrating and fascinating chapter in his entire life. Imagine this. You're flipping through the life story of William Shakespeare, and suddenly, the pages go blank. Not metaphorically, literally. After 1585, when his twins Hamlet and Judith are baptized, there isn't a single confirmed trace of him for nearly a decade. It's as if history hit pause. One minute, he's a newly married young father in the sleepy town of Stratford-upon-Avon, and the next, boom, he's re-emerging in London as a rising star in the theater world, already infamous enough to be insulted in print. So, what happened during those lost years? And more importantly, why don't we know? Let's start with the facts. Between 1585 and 1592, there is no official record of where Shakespeare was, what he was doing, or how he suddenly became one of the most talked about playwrights in London. There are no letters, no diaries, no eyewitness accounts, not even vague mentions in other people's documents. This is not just a gap, it's a vacuum. And in the world of literary history, vacuums get filled with theories, myths, and the occasional totally unhinged guess. Theory number 1. He was a schoolteacher. One of the more reasonable theories is that Shakespeare spent these years working as a tutor or schoolmaster in the English countryside. Maybe someone with a little money and a big library hired him to educate their children. It would explain his apparent fluency with classical texts and his obsession with language. But if this theory is true, it raises a question. How does a rural tutor with no university degree and no theater connections suddenly break into London's most elite creative circles? Either he was extremely good at networking or something else was going on. Theory number 2. He joined a traveling theater troupe. Another compelling theory is that Shakespeare linked up with one of the many traveling acting companies that roamed England during the 1580s. These troupes performed in town squares, noble estates, even taverns, anywhere there was a crowd, and a few coins to collect. If Shakespeare joined up with them, he would have learned stagecraft firsthand. How to act, how to manage props, how to write for loud, distracted audiences. It's a romantic image, isn't it? The young bard hauling scenery from town to town, soaking up regional dialects, learning what made people laugh, cry, and cheer. It would also explain how he later wrote so confidently about the lives of actors and the backstage world of performance. Theory number 3. He fled Stratford after committing a crime. And now we enter the petty crime genre. Local legends in Stratford claim that young William got caught poaching deer from the estate of Sir Thomas Lucy, a powerful local landowner. According to this story, Lucy had Shakespeare whipped for the offense, and Shakespeare, in turn, mocked Lucy in a scathing, satirical poem that got him into even deeper trouble. The legend goes that he fled town to avoid prosecution and never looked back. Did it happen? Maybe. Or maybe people just love imagining the bard as a rebellious, poetic troublemaker on the run. Either way, it's juicy. Theory number 4. He went to Italy. This one's for the armchair romantics. Some scholars suggest that Shakespeare traveled to Italy during these lost years, soaking in Renaissance art, politics, and culture. Why? Because his plays, Romeo and Juliet, Othello, The Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, are weirdly specific in their knowledge of Italian cities. We're talking about detailed descriptions of Verona, Venice, and Padua, including obscure landmarks and social customs that weren't widely known in England. How did he get those right if he never left the country? Coincidence? Book smarts? Or was he sipping wine in Florence and eavesdropping on the locals? Theory number 5. He was a spy. Now for the high drama, cloak and dagger theory. Elizabethan England was a surveillance state run by master spy Francis Walsingham, who kept a tight grip on Catholic dissent and foreign intrigue. Some historians speculate that Shakespeare, educated, discreet, politically neutral, could have been recruited as an informant. If so, those missing years weren't spent writing love sonnets. They were spent lurking in the shadows of political plots. Sounds wild? Sure. But when you realize that so many major players in Shakespeare's later circle had ties to espionage, Christopher Marlowe included, it doesn't feel entirely out of reach. So which theory is true? The frustrating answer is, we don't know. Not because no one's looked, people have obsessed over this for centuries, but because Shakespeare left behind no clues. He didn't talk about these years later in life. He never wrote a memoir. He never explained how a small-town boy with no title and no connections became a literary juggernaut. It's as if he wanted those years to disappear. And maybe he did. Maybe that's part of the performance. The idea that Shakespeare arrives in London fully formed, like Athena springing from Zeus's forehead, armed with pen, wit, and tragedy. Maybe the missing years were his way of building the legend. But for every lost detail, one thing becomes clearer. When Shakespeare finally reappears in 1592, he's not just some struggling writer trying to break in. He's already causing enough of a stir to be publicly insulted by Robert Greene, a dying playwright who called him an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers. Translation? Shakespeare was killing it, and the insiders hated it. So whatever he was doing during those lost years, it worked. And now, with his past behind him, William Shakespeare was about to rewrite the future of English theater. But before he wrote Hamlet, Macbeth, or King Lear, he had to navigate plague, politics, petty rivalries, and the brutal realities of London's entertainment industry. When William Shakespeare finally re-emerged from the fog of history around 1592, he wasn't asking for a seat at the table. He was already being talked about at it. And not always kindly. His arrival in London's theater world was not quiet. His plays were already being performed, His name was being passed around in literary circles, and most tellingly, he was already getting dragged in print, a clear sign he was making waves. The now famous diss came from a playwright named Robert Greene, who, on his deathbed, published a bitter pamphlet slamming Shakespeare as an upstart crow. Let's unpack that. Greene's insult was a loaded one. The phrase, upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, accused Shakespeare of being a social climber, a nobody who had dared to dress himself in the refined style of educated playwrights. Translation: who let the glovemaker's kid into the club? Worse, Greene was seething that Shakespeare, lacking a university education and elite connections, was gaining popularity and money by borrowing the work of more learned men. But if Greene was trying to sabotage Shakespeare's reputation, it backfired beautifully. The pamphlet accidentally confirmed Shakespeare's success. You don't publicly throw shade unless someone's already a threat, and Shakespeare, it seemed, was becoming one fast. London in the 1590s wasn't just a city, it was a pressure cooker. It was packed with merchants, rogues, nobles, apprentices, pickpockets, and plague. Especially plague. Bubonic outbreaks were so frequent that theaters had to shut down regularly to avoid mass infection. At one point, from 1592 to 1594, almost all performances were suspended. For playwrights, that was more than inconvenient, it was financially ruinous. And yet, even during those closures, Shakespeare's writing didn't stop. He pivoted to poetry. In 1593 and 1594, he published Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, both lush, dramatic, and a little risque. These were not just literary experiments. They were calculated moves to build patronage, and they worked. He caught the eye of Henry Wriothesley, the young Earl of Southampton, who became one of his earliest patrons, and possibly more, depending on how closely you read those sonnets. More on that later. By the mid-1590s, with theaters reopening and the Queen's men dissolving, new companies emerged, and one of them, the Lord Chamberlain's men, had a rising star in their ranks, William Shakespeare. Not just as a writer, as a shareholder. This is where things get interesting. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Shakespeare wasn't content to just sell scripts and collect a modest fee. He took a cut of the business. As a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's men and later, the King's men, Shakespeare had skin in the game. He earned money from every performance of his plays. He wasn't just the talent, he was also part of the enterprise. This move insulated him financially and gave him more control over how his work was produced and performed. It also meant that by the time he was writing Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Richard III, he wasn't some starving artist. He was building a career, a brand, and eventually a fortune. In 1599, things went full blockbuster. Shakespeare's company, along with actor-manager Richard Burbage, built the Globe Theatre, the legendary wooden... Oh, that would become synonymous with his name. Situated across the river from the City of London, to dodge censorship laws, naturally. The Globe was a place where up to 3,000 people could gather to watch history plays, comedies, tragedies, and hybrids that defied genre. The atmosphere? Electric. The groundlings, those who paid a penny to stand in the pit, were loud, rowdy, and unfiltered. If a scene dragged, they'd heckle. If they liked a character, they'd cheer like it was a football match. Shakespeare didn't just have to write well. He had to write to hold them. And he did. By the early 1600s, he had produced Hamlet, Julius Caesar, and Twelfth Night. His writing deepened. The characters grew more psychologically complex. The themes became darker, sharper, richer. He was no longer just riffing on old stories. He was elevating them, twisting them, making them deeply human. Then came the ultimate power-up, a royal rebrand. In 1603, when King James I took the throne, Shakespeare's company became the King's Men. This wasn't just a title. It was a stamp of legitimacy, a financial boost, and an open door to court performances. Shakespeare was no longer just entertaining the masses. He was performing for royalty. This also marks the beginning of his most ambitious era, when he wrote Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, and Antony and Cleopatra. These weren't just plays. They were portraits of ambition, madness, betrayal, aging, empire, all the things a monarch might have nightmares about. And yet, the king kept inviting them back. By the time he hit his late 40s, Shakespeare wasn't just successful, he was untouchable. He owned property in London and Stratford. He was earning more than any other writer of his time. And he'd written himself into literary history, with works already being published, pirated, quoted, and parroted. But success in Elizabethan London didn't come without risk. The plague could return. The theaters could be shut again. Political winds could shift. Rivals were always waiting. And Shakespeare, who had once been mocked for his lack of education, was now the standard other writers were measured against. It was an empire built on blank verse, blood, betrayal, and surprisingly bawdy jokes. It's easy to think of Shakespeare purely as a literary figure, a dreamy wordsmith whose plays just happened to survive. But let's be clear, by the early 1600s, William Shakespeare wasn't just famous, he was rich. Not by a nice dinner rich, not modest country house rich. We're talking owns multiple properties, has diversified investments, and probably doesn't get out of bed for less than a court performance rich. This is the part of the story where the struggling playwright becomes a financial power player. So how did he do it? It starts with one savvy, game-changing decision. He became a shareholder in his own success. Most writers in Shakespeare's day got paid a one-time fee for their scripts, usually just a few pounds. The theater company would own the play, stage it, profit from it, and the writer? Back to writing the next one, hoping to sell again. But Shakespeare? He joined the Lord Chamberlain's men not just as their resident writer, but as a stakeholder. When the company performed well, he profited. When they sold tickets, he got a cut. This changed everything. When the troupe later built the Globe Theatre in 1599, Shakespeare was one of the co-investors. That meant part of every ticket sold, every ale poured, every penny dropped into the box office, went into his pocket. He had literal ownership in the infrastructure of his own fame. He wasn't just the talent, he was the business. And when King James I came to power in 1603 and renamed the troupe the King's Men, Shakespeare's company was not only legit, they were elite. Performing at court, under royal patronage, guaranteed steady income and elevated prestige. And unlike many playwrights of the time who died broke or in debt, cough Marlowe, Shakespeare built generational wealth. Forget the starving artist trope. Shakespeare was investing like a man who understood the value of land. In 1597, he bought New Place, one of the largest houses in Stratford-upon-Avon. It wasn't just a sentimental homecoming, it was a power move. He was signaling that he'd made it, and he was putting roots down in his hometown, not as a local boy made good, but as a man of means. But he didn't stop there. He bought multiple properties, both residential and agricultural, including farmland and tenements that provided regular income. In 1613, he purchased a share in the Blackfriars Gatehouse, a property in a desirable part of London. Some speculate it was used for storage or lodging visiting actors. Others think it was an investment or even a tax strategy. Either way, it shows that Shakespeare understood how to diversify. He also made money off grain speculation. Yes, Shakespeare was literally flipping grain in times of scarcity to turn a profit. During a period of food shortages in 1598, he was named in local records for hoarding malt, used in brewing and baking, possibly waiting to sell it at a higher price. Bard or not, that's some cold business instinct. Now here's where it gets tricky. Shakespeare didn't always control his own publications. In his lifetime, many of his plays were printed in quarto editions, some authorized, many not. These were cheap, single-play booklets sold to the reading public, often full of errors, edits, and inconsistencies. Think of them like bootleg concert recordings, popular, messy, and very profitable, but rarely in the artist's control. Shakespeare didn't seem too bothered. His real money was in live performances, not publishing. That said, he did oversee the publication of two of his narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, which were wildly successful and reprinted multiple times. They were lush, scandalous, and deeply appealing to the aristocracy, and possibly a love letter to his wealthy patron, the Earl of Southampton. But the biggest publishing moment came after his death in 1623, when two of his actor friends, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, compiled 36 of his plays into a collected volume known as the First Folio. Without it, we might not have Macbeth, Julius Caesar, or The Tempest today. It was the first time Shakespeare's work was formally canonized, but by then, he was gone, and his literary estate was already secure. One of the most striking things about Shakespeare's financial success is how rare it was. Most writers of his time were treated like scribes, disposable, replaceable, underpaid. Playwrights were anonymous or ignored. Shakespeare? He was credited by name, respected by nobles, envied by rivals, and trusted by royalty. He was also involved in legal battles, land disputes, and lending money with interest. The fun financial stuff you don't usually associate with poetic genius. But this was all part of the image. Shakespeare the businessman, Shakespeare the landowner, Shakespeare the citizen who made damn sure his family name would not go back to being obscure glovemakers. When he died in 1616, Shakespeare left behind a detailed will, a legal document that scholars have pored over like it's the Da Vinci Code. He left most of his wealth and property to his eldest daughter, Susanna, his wife, and, famously, received only his second-best bed. Was that an insult? Was it symbolic? Was it romantic? We don't know. But what we do know is this. The man who once had to rush into marriage without a penny to his name died as one of Stratford's wealthiest citizens, respected, powerful, and preserved. By 1610, William Shakespeare, the working-class son of a glove-maker, the poet-turned-property mogul, the man who turned English into high art, was quietly stepping back from public life. At just 46 years old, he was at the height of his powers, but something had changed. Whether he was tired, satisfied, or simply ready to trade the roar of the globe for the calm of the Avon River, Shakespeare made the rare move for a celebrity of his status. He left the spotlight while he was still on top. He began retiring from London, moving his affairs back to Stratford-upon-Avon, the town he once left behind. He didn't stop writing entirely. Some of his final plays, like The Tempest, Cymbeline, and The Winter's Tale, still appeared in this period, but his output slowed. His collaboration with younger playwrights, like John Fletcher, suggests he was mentoring the next generation rather than fighting to stay at center stage. So, what was he doing in Stratford? The records say he was managing property, pursuing small legal disputes, and living as a wealthy gentleman. He had tenants. He collected rents. He loaned money, sued over debts, and showed up in court to protect his investments. It's such a jarringly mundane end for a man who once conjured kings, ghosts, and doomed lovers. But for Shakespeare, real success wasn't fame. It was security. After watching his father's fortune collapse, he made sure his own legacy was unshakable. But even in retirement, the man remained curiously silent. He gave no interviews, not that anyone did, wrote no memoirs, and left behind no letters, no diary, and most frustratingly, no record of what he actually thought about his life's work. That absence has fueled centuries of speculation. Did he love his wife? Did he feel regret over abandoning his children? Did he know he was writing for the ages? Or was he just grinding out scripts to keep the company afloat? We don't know. What we do know is that in early 1616, William Shakespeare drafted his last will and testament. He was only 52 years old, not particularly elderly by the standards of the time, but the tone of the document is clinical, focused, and final. He was clearly wrapping things up. Scholars argue over whether he was ill at the time. Some suggest he had been sick for months. Others believe his death was sudden. And then, on April 23rd, 1616, a date that just happens to be his 52nd birthday, he died. The cause? Completely unknown. No physician's report. No eyewitness description. Nothing scandalous was recorded. But then again, the silence is loud. A local tradition claims he died after a night of heavy drinking with fellow writers Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton, but there's no evidence. That story comes from a source written decades later, more folklore than fact. He was buried 2 days later, in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, with no grand funeral, No massive public procession and no national announcement. In London, the theaters kept going. The city didn't stop. There was no formal mourning for England's greatest playwright, just a quiet burial in his hometown, under a slab of stone with an ominous warning carved above his grave. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear, to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. That's right, Shakespeare cursed his own grave. It's as if he knew that, even in death, people wouldn't leave him alone. And he was right. For over 400 years, no one has dared disturb his remains. Not when the church was renovated. Not even when modern technology could have revealed how he died. That curse worked, but the mystery didn't end there. Why didn't Hiswell mention his plays? Why didn't he ensure they were preserved? Why did it read like a businessman's ledger rather than a literary legacy? Some believe he left that part of his life behind him on purpose. Others think he trusted his actor friends to protect his work, and thank God they did. 7 years after his death, in 1623, they published the First Folio, the monumental collection that preserved 36 of his plays. Without it, half of his masterpieces would have been lost. So, what kind of man dies quietly, almost anonymously, after redefining an entire language? Maybe one who'd already said everything he needed to say, on stage, in verse, through kings and fools, ghosts and lovers. He didn't build statues of himself. He didn't sign off with grand declarations. He let the work speak. And it still does. When William Shakespeare died in 1616, he was respected, but not deified. He wasn't declared a national treasure. He wasn't mourned in Parliament. He didn't become an instant saint of literature. In fact, for a few decades, he was mostly remembered as a reliable playwright whose work had been good for business. If you were in the theater world, you knew the name, but if you were a scholar or nobleman, you were still probably quoting Seneca or quoting Latin like it was a personality trait. But that all changed in 1623, when two of Shakespeare's actor friends, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, published the First Folio, a 900-page collection of 36 of his plays, 7 years after his death. The First Folio was a literary rescue mission. It took scripts scattered across playhouses and pirate prints and preserved them in one grand, official volume. And, in its introduction, a glowing tribute from playwright Ben Jonson, who wrote, "He was not of an age, but for all time." That line stuck, because it was the first sign that Shakespeare was becoming more than just a successful writer. He was becoming timeless. Throughout the 1600s and into the early 1700s, Shakespeare's reputation kept building, slowly, like a cult that no one realized was forming. His plays stayed in the theatrical rotation, especially the crowd pleasers like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and Othello. But they were often heavily rewritten, censored, or improved to fit newer, more fashionable tastes. In 1681, for example, a version of King Lear was staged with a happy ending. Why? Because the original ending was too depressing. Imagine changing the ending of Titanic because audiences didn't want Jack to die. That's how Shakespeare's work was treated, important, but not yet sacred. But by the 18th century, something began to shift. Enlightenment thinkers started to see in Shakespeare something deeper than drama. Critics like Samuel Johnson and Alexander Pope began analyzing his plays as literature rather than just performance. They wrote essays. They published annotated editions. Shakespeare became not just popular, but prestigious. And then came the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats, who took things up a notch. To them, Shakespeare wasn't just the greatest English writer. He was a visionary, a prophet of the human soul, the one who saw into the minds of kings, murderers, lovers, madmen, and dreamers. By the 1800s, bardolatry was born, the worship of Shakespeare as a nearly divine literary force. During the 19th century, especially under Queen Victoria, Shakespeare became more than just a playwright. He became a symbol of British cultural superiority. His works were staged in elite theatres, taught in schools, quoted in Parliament, and exported across the growing British Empire. Wherever the Union Jack went, So did Hamlet and Macbeth. Statues of Shakespeare were erected in London, Stratford, and far beyond. His birthplace became a tourist destination. His words were used in textbooks, sermons, and political speeches. Shakespeare became less of a writer and more of a national product. But this wasn't just about England. The world was catching on. By the 20th century, Shakespeare's plays had been translated into over 100 languages. Macbeth was performed in Soviet Russia. Hamlet was staged in apartheid South Africa as a protest. Romeo and Juliet was turned into West Side Story, and later, Baz Luhrmann's gun-blazing, neon-soaked fever dream. In Japan, King Lear inspired the samurai epic ran by Akira Kurosawa. In Bollywood, Othello became Omkra. In Harlem, Julius Caesar became a parable for political revolution. Shakespeare proved infinitely adaptable. He was no longer just English, he was universal. His themes, ambition, jealousy, love, madness, betrayal, translated into every culture because they were already human. Of course, the bigger his reputation grew, the harder it became to believe that a glovemaker's son from Stratford actually wrote it all. Enter the Shakespeare authorship question. Since the 1800s, a wide range of skeptics, some academic, many conspiracy-minded, have questioned whether Shakespeare really wrote the works attributed to him. Candidates include Francis Bacon, Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, Christopher Marlowe, and even Queen Elizabeth I. The arguments range from elitist, he didn't go to university, to bizarre, there are hidden codes in the plays. But the core anxiety is always the same. How could someone so ordinary create something so extraordinary? Yet despite the noise, there's zero hard evidence supporting these alternatives, and volumes of scholarly work affirming Shakespeare as the real author. But the mystery persists, adding a strange little subplot to the mythos. Even in death, the drama follows him. Today, Shakespeare is an institution. His plays are taught in schools, analyzed in dissertations, performed at the Royal Shakespeare Company, at the Globe in London, and in community theaters worldwide. Tourism in Stratford is a multi-million-dollar industry. Academic conferences are held in his name. Entire university departments are built on the study of his work. He's quoted at weddings, funerals, protests, and coronations. His name sells books, movies, merch, and entire ideologies. He is, in short, a global brand. So what do we make of it all? William Shakespeare began life as a provincial teenager in a country town, rushed into a scandalous marriage, vanished from the record, and returned to change the course of English literature. He died quietly, without fanfare, and yet, centuries later, he's one of the most recognized names in human history. He never wrote a memoir. He never explained his process. And yet, somehow, he left behind a body of work that still moves us, still provokes us, still feels more alive than almost anything else ever written. Not bad for the son of a Glover. Why does a man who died in 1616 continue to captivate millions? Why do his plays fill theaters, his quotes light up social media, and his characters become shorthand for every human emotion imaginable? It's easy to say it's because he was great, but the truth is deeper and more fascinating. At his core, Shakespeare wasn't just writing stories. He was mapping the human experience in its fullest, messiest, most contradictory form. Shakespeare's genius lies in his ability to create characters that feel real, flawed, complex, endlessly human. Hamlet's indecision, Lady Macbeth's ambition, King Lear's heartbreak, Juliet's passion, these aren't just historical figures. They are archetypes we all recognize. We see ourselves in them, centuries and cultures removed. His plays ask questions about love and power, identity and madness, loyalty and betrayal, questions that are still debated today. What does it mean to be human? What happens when ambition runs unchecked? How do we cope with loss and grief? Shakespeare's work is a mirror, reflecting our own struggles back at us, no matter the era. Then there's the language itself, poetic, inventive, endlessly surprising. Shakespeare is credited with coining thousands of English words and phrases we still use every day: break the ice, wild goose chase, heart of gold. His rhythm, his wordplay, His command of metaphor make his works thrilling to hear and powerful to perform. And the magic is that his language is never just decorative. It's a tool to reveal character, emotion, and conflict. His soliloquies are inner worlds spoken aloud. His insults are sharp and unforgettable. His speeches can rally armies or soothe a broken heart. Shakespeare wrote for the stage, and that's important. His plays come alive when performed. The mix of spectacle, emotion, and storytelling creates a communal experience that bridges time and culture. Audiences throughout history have seen their own lives reflected in his characters, finding solace, excitement, or catharsis. The fact that his plays can be adapted endlessly, from traditional Shakespearean productions to modern settings, from opera to hip-hop, proves their remarkable flexibility and relevance. His stories are a canvas on which every generation paints its own fears, hopes, and dreams. In a world that feels ever more fragmented, Shakespeare serves as a cultural anchor. He connects us to the past, showing how people in the 16th and 17th centuries thought, felt, and dreamed, but also pushes us to question ourselves today. His work challenges authority, explores justice and morality, and reminds us that beneath our social differences, our humanity is shared. That's why his plays still belong in schools, on stages, and in our conversations. Finally, Shakespeare matters because he's alive. Not in a literal sense, but alive in culture, language, art, and the very way we understand storytelling. Every production, every adaptation, every new reader breathes life into his work. He's the ultimate reminder that great art doesn't just survive. It evolves, it grows, it sparks new ideas and passions centuries later. So next time you hear someone quote, "to be or not to be," or catch a modern twist on Romeo and Juliet, remember, you're tapping into a legacy that has shaped how we tell stories and understand ourselves. William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, wrote not just for his time, but for all time. And that is why, 400 years later, he still matters.